On a storm-tossed night over the Atlantic, passengers clutched their seats as the plane lost all signals, swallowed by thunder and chaos. In seat 11A, a weary man and his loyal German shepherd sat in silence, until the dog lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the storm as if he could feel the sky itself. What followed was no ordinary flight. Guided by instinct, the man's military training, and the dog's uncanny sense of balance, they fought to steady a jet that seemed destined to fall. This is a story of faith, survival, and a four-legged hero who turned despair into a miracle. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. The Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath a sky that seemed to unravel into chaos. Clouds, once soft and silver, had thickened into monstrous towers of slate, each one lit from within by veins of white lightning. Rain lashed sideways across the windows of the Boeing 777, leaving long streaks that pulsed in rhythm with the turbulence. Inside the cabin, the temperature had dropped noticeably, and the usual hum of jet engines now sounded strained, a roar that cracked and faltered like a great beast being forced to run through a storm too wild to tame. Seatbelt signs glowed red above rows of weary passengers. Mothers clutched children. Businessmen gripped their armrests, and elderly travelers pressed trembling lips to whispered prayers. The overhead lights flickered, strobing faces into masks of fear. In this pressurized world of recycled air and anxiety, every jolt from the storm felt like a hand of fate, shaking the fragile tube of metal and hope that dared to challenge the sky. Among these passengers sat a man in seat 11A, a figure who seemed at once out of place and yet perfectly suited for disaster. He was in his late 40s, though the years had etched themselves more deeply into him than the calendar suggested. His hair, once a rich chestnut, was now peppered with gray, uncombed and swept back by neglect rather than style. A beard clung to his jaw, coarse and uneven, flecked with silver, and on his weathered face the lines ran deep, carved not just by time, but by choices, by losses, by battles that had left their shadows behind. His eyes were the color of storm water, gray-blue, restless, forever searching, as if they carried the reflection of the sky he once knew intimately. The man's name was Daniel Harper, though few on board knew it, and fewer still would guess the life that had brought him here. Once, long ago, Daniel had worn a uniform, sitting at the controls of massive refueling aircraft in the Air National Guard. He had been known for his steadiness in the air, for his calm voice when turbulence made lesser pilots curse. But after a catastrophic mission over desert skies, when an equipment failure had turned routine into nightmare, Daniel had walked away from aviation, weighed down by guilt over a comrade who never came home. Since then, his life had drifted, much like him now, suspended in this hollow journey across an ocean, a man haunted by ghosts he refused to name. At his feet, curled with quiet dignity, lay a German shepherd named Rex. The dog was no longer young. His muzzle bore a dusting of white, and his once glistening coat of black and tan had dulled slightly with age. Yet there was a sturdiness about him, a soldier's posture that spoke of training and loyalty. His amber eyes gleamed with intelligence, scanning the cabin and the subtle vibrations in the floor with the vigilance of a guardian. Rex had been Daniel's companion for nearly a decade, first trained as a service dog for veterans and later becoming Daniel's shadow, his reason to keep moving when the world seemed to offer nothing else. Unlike his master, Rex bore no visible scars of regret, only the calm assurance of a creature whose life's purpose was devotion. Across the aisle sat Marjorie Lane, a woman in her early 60s with neatly pressed clothes and pearl earrings that trembled each time the aircraft jolted. Her silver hair was styled meticulously, a habit from her years as a librarian in Connecticut, where she once reigned over shelves of history and literature. Marjorie had a kind face, though lines of loneliness showed at the corners of her mouth, the result of widowhood that had arrived too soon. She had boarded the flight to visit her daughter in Dublin, clutching a novel she had read half a dozen times but never finished. Now the pages shook in her hands as she whispered psalms under her breath, her gaze darting often to Daniel and the dog at his side. Behind Daniel sat a young man, perhaps 25, named Ethan Brooks. He had an angular jaw, clean-shaven, and wore a hoodie that proclaimed allegiance to a rock band. Ethan was traveling alone for the first time, a backpack under his seat, carrying everything he thought he needed for a year abroad. His skin was pale, his eyes darting nervously between the window and the glowing seatbelt sign. Confidence was not his companion. He was restless, tapping his foot in frantic rhythm. A childhood marked by absent parents had left him wary of strangers, yet in this moment, fear made him ache for connection, even from people he had never spoken to. The plane jolted violently, a drop so sudden that trays clattered, cups spilled, and a child shrieked in panic. Oxygen masks trembled in their housings overhead, threatening to drop. The cabin erupted into scattered cries and gasps. Somewhere, a man shouted angrily, demanding answers from no one in particular. Somewhere else, a woman clutched her rosary so tightly her knuckles blanched. And then the intercom sputtered, not with the measured voice of a captain, but with static and fragments of words. The crew tried to mask their worry, but fear betrayed them in small ways. The rushed steps, the clipped tones, the way their eyes avoided meeting those of the passengers. A flight attendant named Clara Mendoza, a tall woman with warm brown skin and jet-black hair pulled into a bun, moved down the aisle with brisk efficiency. Her uniform was crisp, her posture practiced, but her lips pressed thin against the tremor of her own fear. Clara was known among her colleagues as compassionate yet unyielding, a woman who had raised 2 children alone after her husband's sudden death. The sky had become her second home, but tonight it threatened to turn on her. She leaned close to reassure passengers, even as her own hands betrayed a slight tremor when she steadied herself against the overhead bin. Outside, thunder rolled like artillery fire, battering the fuselage. The storm seemed to press against the aircraft from every side, rattling it with invisible fists. Suddenly, the cockpit lights flickered through the partially open door at the front, and Clara's voice carried faintly. "We've lost the signal." Her words cut through the cabin like a blade. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his instincts flaring awake. He had heard those words before, in a desert sky where static had meant death. His chest tightened as if an old wound had been torn open. Beside him, Rex stirred, rising from his place on the floor. The dog's ears pricked sharply, and he gave a low, resonant whine, his gaze fixed not on the cabin, but on the storm beyond the window. It was as though he felt the tilt of the plane, the shifting balance that instruments could no longer measure. The lights sputtered again, plunging the cabin into dim twilight before roaring back with sickly fluorescence. A chorus of prayers rose, tangled with sobs. Ethan gripped the seat in front of him, knuckles white, muttering that he never should have taken this flight. Marjorie closed her eyes tightly, reciting words her late husband used to whisper whenever storms rattled their old house. Clara steadied herself and continued down the aisle, her voice trying to be calm as she urged passengers to remain seated. The engines groaned as if protesting the very air. The aircraft tilted sharply, luggage bins burst open, and belongings rained down. A baby's cry cut through the cacophony. For a moment it felt as though the storm itself had swallowed them whole, erasing the world beyond the thin shell of metal. And there, amid chaos and desperation, sat Daniel Harper with Rex pressed close to his leg. His weathered hand rested on the dog's back, steadying himself not just against the storm, but against the flood of memories clawing at him. He could feel the old instincts stirring, the muscle memory of a man who once held lives in his hands. And though he had sworn never to return to the skies that haunted him, the storm was calling him back. As lightning forked across the sky and the cabin shook once more, Daniel whispered under his breath, though perhaps it was to Rex, perhaps to himself. "Hold steady. This isn't over." The plane lurched downward again, and the chapter closed with the cabin's collective breath hanging in the air, suspended between fear and faith. The cabin felt smaller now, compressed by fear, every breath thick with anticipation. The storm outside pressed against the windows with relentless force, thunder vibrating through the fuselage like the pounding of war drums. Passengers whispered among themselves, voices blending into a low, frantic murmur, as if speaking softly might somehow soften the fury outside. A woman clutched her child and asked if they were going to die. A businessman with slicked back hair and a tie, now crooked from panic, demanded to know what the crew was hiding. Fear traveled faster than turbulence, passing from row to row until it filled the air like smoke. Clara Mendoza, the tall flight attendant with warm brown skin and hair pulled tight, tried to steady the crowd. Her calm voice carried, though there was strain beneath it. She explained that the captain was having trouble maintaining balance in the storm and that the aircraft had lost its navigation signal. Passengers gasped. Marjorie Lane, the silver-haired widow with trembling hands, pressed her palms together in prayer. Ethan Brooks, the anxious young man behind Daniel, muttered nervously, his voice quivering. "We're blind in the sky." The fear was contagious, but Clara forced herself to stand firm, moving aisle to aisle, her dark eyes focused not on her own dread, but on holding others steady. At seat 11A, Daniel Harper remained still for a moment, his storm-colored eyes half closed. He seemed to retreat inward, back into the shadows of memories he had buried deep. The roar of engines and the flicker of lights blurred into the background as he took a long breath, pressing his hand firmly against Rex's thick fur. His loyal German shepherd leaned against him, warm and solid, a reminder that he was not alone. When Daniel opened his eyes again, they no longer carried the distant glaze of a wanderer. They were sharp, alert, the eyes of a man who had once been trained to guide machines through chaos. Slowly, he unbuckled his belt. Ethan noticed first, his voice catching in his throat. "Hey, sir, what are you doing?" Daniel ignored him, rising with deliberate steadiness, his boots scuffed and heavy against the carpet. His beard framed his jaw like iron bristles, giving him the look of a man who had seen too many hard winters. His posture carried the weight of someone who had sworn never to fly again yet was compelled by something greater than himself. As he stood, Rex rose with him, the dog's amber eyes fixed on the trembling ceiling lights, ears pricked forward. Gasps spread across nearby rows. Marjorie lowered her prayer book and stared at him, her pearl earrings catching the flicker of lightning. "Who is he?" she whispered. Daniel didn't answer. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with resolve, stepping into the aisle as the plane shuddered violently. Clara intercepted him, planting herself firmly in his path. Though fear rippled through her, her training anchored her feet. "Sir," she said with a measured tone, "you must remain seated. It's dangerous to move right now." Her voice, though stern, carried the compassion of someone used to calming storms in people's hearts. Daniel's reply was quiet, but carried the weight of command. "I've flown through storms like this before. You've lost navigation, haven't you? You need help." His tone made Clara hesitate, and she studied him closely. His clothes were worn, his jacket too thin for the chill in the cabin, his boots patched with years of travel. Yet his posture was steady, his words carried knowledge. Another flight attendant, Mark Thompson, moved closer. Mark was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered with short blonde hair cropped neatly and a clean-shaven face. His blue eyes usually sparkled with humor, but now they were clouded with tension. A former firefighter who had once pulled children from a burning house, he carried himself with quiet bravery and a deep sense of responsibility. "Clara, let him speak," he said softly. Then to Daniel, "Who are you?" Daniel's gaze did not falter. "Air National Guard, KC-135 Stratotanker. Years ago the words came without pride, only necessity. If you've lost signals, you need someone who knows how to fly blind. I can't fly this bird, but I can guide. And I have something else." His hand rested on Rex's head. The dog stood tall now, tail rigid, head turning subtly as if feeling the storm itself. Rex's chest rose and fell steadily, but his eyes were alive with awareness. Daniel continued. "Rex was trained with me. He senses balance. He feels shifts in weight, direction, even before instruments. When the storm throws us off, he'll know. You let me in that cockpit, and I'll help your pilot keep this plane level." The passengers around them fell silent, listening. Skepticism hung in the air, but so did desperate hope. Marjorie's lips trembled as she whispered to the woman beside her, "Perhaps God sent them." Ethan's nervous tapping stilled, his eyes wide with disbelief. Clara bit her lip, her hand trembling against the seat back. Her instinct told her to protect the passengers, to keep control. But something about Daniel's calm, the quiet authority in his gravelly voice, made her pause. She glanced at Rex, whose ears twitched with each rumble of turbulence, and for the first time in that endless night, she felt a flicker of something like faith. The aircraft lurched again, harder this time, sending drinks spilling and a baby into fresh cries. Clara steadied herself and nodded once, decisive. "Follow me." As Daniel moved forward with Rex pacing at his side, whispers spread down the cabin. Some passengers stared at him with suspicion, others with awe. The businessman who had demanded answers earlier scoffed aloud. "This is madness, trusting a vagabond and his mutt." His voice was sharp, his cheeks flushed. His name was Richard Cole, a wealthy property developer in his late 50s with thinning blonde hair slicked back and a suit tailored to perfection. His round face was smooth, but carried the arrogance of a man used to being obeyed. Years of ruthless deals had hardened him, and compassion had been traded long ago for profit. He sneered now, desperate to regain control by belittling others. But Richard's words were drowned by another violent shake of the plane. Suitcases rattled, oxygen masks swung dangerously close to releasing. Passengers clutched one another tighter. In that moment, Daniel's steady figure, framed by lightning beyond the windows, seemed less like a drifter and more like the anchor they all craved. Clara led him toward the cockpit, Mark following close behind in case passengers panicked. Daniel glanced back only once. His gaze swept over the frightened faces, then settled on Marjorie, who still held her prayer book. She met his eyes and mouthed, "Bring us home." Daniel nodded once, then turned forward, his hand resting on Rex's shoulders. The German shepherd moved with purpose, muscles shifting smoothly under his aging but powerful frame. His ears flicked with each gust of turbulence as if listening to whispers no human could hear. When they reached the reinforced door of the cockpit, Clara knocked sharply. The door opened slightly, revealing a young co-pilot whose pale face glistened with sweat. He couldn't have been more than 30. His nameplate read, James Ward. His dark brown hair was plastered to his forehead, and his green eyes darted nervously over the panels behind him. Ward's lips trembled as he tried to mask panic with professionalism, but it was failing. Clara's voice was firm. "We have someone who can help." Ward's eyes flicked to Daniel, skeptical, then to Rex, whose steady gaze seemed almost unnatural in its calm. The storm groaned around them, thunder echoing like cannon fire, and in that noise Ward's hesitation melted into need. He pulled the door open wider. "Get in." As Daniel stepped into the narrow cockpit with Rex at his heel, the passengers behind them held their collective breath. For the first time since the storm had swallowed them, there was a sense that someone, something, might know the way through. And in the dim light of the cockpit, surrounded by alarms and shadows, Daniel Harper prepared to face the sky he had once abandoned, this time with Rex, his four-legged co-pilot, at his side. The cockpit was a narrow cathedral of alarms and shadows, its panels blinking with frantic signals, its air thick with the scent of sweat, ozone, and strained machinery. Outside, lightning ripped across the sky, throwing ghostly flashes through the windows, illuminating the terrified face of James Ward, the young co-pilot. His dark hair clung damp to his forehead, his green eyes wild with fear, hands clutching the yoke as if he were strangling it rather than guiding it. Every jolt of turbulence rattled his frame, and his lips moved with half-formed curses, half-formed prayers. Daniel Harper stepped inside with Rex close at his heel. His boots scraped against the floor, steady in rhythm, a contrast to the trembling environment. His storm-colored eyes swept the panels with the instinctive recognition of someone who had once lived in this world of dials and gauges. His beard shadowed his jaw, making his expression sharper, sterner, like a soldier summoned back to a battlefield he thought he had left forever. The cockpit was cramped with 3 jump seats along the wall. A man occupied one of them. The unconscious captain. His nameplate read, Captain William Sloan. He was in his late 50s, with broad shoulders that sagged now against the restraints. His face, square-jawed and deeply lined, carried the authority of decades in command. His short-cropped hair had gone silver at the temples, and beneath his closed eyes, his skin looked pale, almost gray, damp with sweat. He groaned faintly, a sound that suggested both exhaustion and resistance. Captain Sloan had been a man known for his pride in precision, a stickler for procedure. But tonight his body had betrayed him. Daniel's voice broke through the chaos, low and steady, a deliberate anchor against the storm's pull. "Don't fight the storm," he said, his gaze fixed on James Ward. "Feel it. Let it tell you where it wants to push. Then guide. Don't wrestle." Ward looked at him with raw panic. "Who the hell are you?" His voice cracked, strained by fear and fatigue. Daniel moved closer, his presence filling the small space. "Someone who's flown blind before." "You're losing control because you're fighting. Stop fighting." Ward's knuckles were white on the yoke. His shoulders shook. His inexperience hung heavy in the air. He had logged hours, yes, but never in conditions that swallowed signals and mocked instruments. He had been hired for promise, for quick reflexes and academic brilliance. But storms cared little for diplomas. Clara Mendoza, the tall attendant with brown skin and dark eyes, remained just behind the door, one hand braced against the wall, watching with a mixture of worry and fragile hope. Mark Thompson stood behind her, his broad frame tense, ready to step in if chaos broke out, though his eyes betrayed the same desperation every soul on board carried. Daniel crouched and tapped Rex's flank. The German shepherd stepped forward with a deliberate grace, his thick coat brushing against Daniel's leg. The dog lowered himself to the center of the cockpit floor, steadying his paws wide apart. His amber eyes scanned the windows, as if reading the invisible forces outside. His ears flicked, his head turned slightly with each new gust, and his body stiffened or relaxed, depending on the shifts in balance. Ward frowned, incredulous. "What's he doing here?" Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "He's been trained with me. He feels shifts in weight, in pull, in direction. You ignore him. You'll lose. You trust him. You'll have a chance for a moment." Silence reigned, save for the roar of the engines and the groans of the airframe. Then the plane dropped sharply, and Rex's head snapped left, his body angling instinctively. Daniel's voice cut through. "Now." Ease left trim, steady on. Ward obeyed, more from reflex than belief, and the aircraft groaned in reluctant obedience, leveling slightly. The young man's eyes widened, as if he had just witnessed a ghost. Clara exhaled, her lips parting in something close to a prayer. Mark's jaw tightened as he muttered, "Holy God." Rex settled again, muscles taut, gaze locked outward as if he could see through storm clouds themselves. The dog did not panic, did not flinch. He simply adjusted, waiting, listening with his whole body. Ward swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his temple. "This is insane." Daniel's tone was calm, almost fatherly. "Insane keeps us alive. You've got two choices, son. Keep strangling the yoke until it breaks you, or listen to the storm and let him show you its rhythm." The younger man hesitated, then nodded once, a shaky surrender to something greater than his own ego. His hands eased their death grip, his breathing steadied, and he began to follow Daniel's quiet instructions. Lightning burst again, filling the cockpit with white fire. Captain Sloane stirred faintly, his lips parting as if to speak, but only a groan escaped. Clara stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on the captain's shoulder, her brown eyes softening with concern. "He's still out of it," she murmured. Daniel didn't glance away from the controls. "Keep him on oxygen. He'll need time. Until then, it's us." The storm pressed harder, crosswinds slamming against the wings. The plane tilted right, passengers screaming faintly beyond the door. Rex rose slightly, shifting his weight and turning his head sharply left. Daniel's eyes snapped to Ward. "Counter now. Left rudder. Don't fight. Glide into it, then ease back." Ward obeyed, his movements shaky but responsive. The aircraft trembled, resisted, then settled into a more level course. Daniel's hand hovered near the panel, not touching, guiding with words alone. In the dim light, Daniel's profile looked carved from granite. The beard shadowed his cheeks, his brows drawn in fierce focus. He was no longer the weary drifter from Seat 11A, but the soldier pilot, resurrected, the man who had once commanded machines of steel and fire in hostile skies. The storm outside might have been merciless, but Daniel Harper was no stranger to merciless skies. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, each one a battle of balance and instinct. Rex shifted again, a low growl rumbling in his throat as the turbulence surged. His body became the metronome by which Ward's hands moved, the compass no machine could provide. Every time the plane lurched, Rex braced, and Daniel's voice followed, calm, commanding, relentless. Finally, Ward's panic began to fade into rhythm. His shoulders loosened, his breathing deepened. He glanced at Daniel, then at the dog, his green eyes filled with something new. Belief. "He really knows," Ward whispered. Daniel's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile, but was swallowed quickly by focus. "He's flown more storms than either of us." Trust him. Clara watched from the doorway, her hand still braced against the frame, her chest rising with each breath of fragile relief. She studied Daniel. The rugged face, the storm-colored eyes, the authority that rolled from him like waves. For the first time that night, she dared to hope. The cockpit hummed with renewed purpose, a fragile harmony born of desperation and trust. Outside, the storm still raged, thunder cracking and lightning tearing the heavens. But inside the narrow chamber, man and dog worked as one, guiding metal through chaos. And as passengers clung to one another in the cabin, unaware of every detail unfolding ahead, the mysterious man from seat 11A and his loyal German shepherd had begun to rewrite the night, not with instruments, but with instinct, courage, and the bond between them. The cockpit shuddered under the violence of the storm, its walls groaning as though the sky itself wished to rip the aircraft apart. The radar screen bled with static, colors bleeding into one another in chaotic spirals, and the dials spun uselessly as if mocking the very idea of control. James Ward's hands trembled above the yoke, his chest rising and falling too quickly, breath shallow and uneven. His face was pale, slick with sweat, every muscle tight with fear. And then, in the heart of this chaos, Rex lifted his head. The German shepherd's amber eyes gleamed in the half-light, his black and tan coat bristling as static charged the air. His ears pricked sharply, rotating like finely tuned instruments, and his body stiffened with sudden clarity. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his muzzle toward the left window, his gaze fixed as though he could see the invisible currents beyond the glass. Daniel Harper's storm-gray eyes caught the movement instantly. His voice cut through the alarms, steady as stone. "Left rudder, now!" Ward blinked, confused. "What?" "Follow him," Daniel barked, pointing toward the dog. Rex's posture had shifted. He braced his paws wide, shoulders leaning slightly, as if the cabin floor itself had tilted beneath him. Daniel's tone carried the weight of command, a man used to being obeyed in the skies. "Ease it left. Don't fight it. Just follow." Ward swallowed hard, but desperation outweighed doubt. He nudged the yoke left, adjusted the rudder with a trembling hand. For a moment, the aircraft resisted, groaning as turbulence battered its wings. Then, almost miraculously, the lurching steadied. The roar of the engine smoothed from a ragged growl into something more controlled. The violent rocking eased to a heavy but manageable sway. Ward's green eyes widened in disbelief. That worked." Daniel's jaw tightened, his beard shadowing the grim lines of his face. "Of course it worked. He feels what you can't." Trust him, Rex remained focused, his body tense but sure, ears twitching with each shift of the storm. Every time the aircraft jolted, the dog adjusted, turning his head, angling his body as though he were in silent conversation with the winds themselves. And every time he shifted, Daniel translated. "Steady pitch, nose up too, roll right by degrees." "Now ease," Ward obeyed, each adjustment smoothing the flight further. Behind them, Clara Mendoza stood frozen near the cockpit door, her tall frame braced against the wall. Her dark eyes were wide, reflecting both awe and fear, her lips parted as she watched the impossible unfold. Mark Thompson, broad-shouldered and vigilant, whispered under his breath, "The dog's flying the damn plane." His voice was half disbelief, half reverence. A groan came from the captain's seat. Captain William Sloane stirred faintly, his square jaw twitching as he tried to rouse himself. His eyelids fluttered open briefly, revealing eyes, clouded by weakness and confusion. He muttered something incoherent before slipping back into a haze, his body betraying the decades of discipline it had once embodied. Clara leaned closer, brushing damp hair from his temple, murmuring encouragement, but it was clear the responsibility lay with Ward, Daniel, and Rex. Another violent gust slammed the fuselage, rattling every loose panel, making the aircraft shiver like a leaf in a storm. Passengers screamed faintly beyond the reinforced door, their fear muffled but palpable. In row 23, Marjorie Lane clutched her prayer book tighter, lips whispering verses, while Ethan Brooks muttered through clenched teeth, "Hold it together, hold it together." Richard Cole sneered, his arrogance faltering into panic as he gripped the armrest of his luxury seat, sweat staining the collar of his expensive shirt. Inside the cockpit, Rex braced again, his body low, ears flicking sharply to the right. Daniel saw it instantly. "Right rudder, slight roll." "Now, hold steady." Ward obeyed, his movements hesitant but improving, guided by Daniel's calm directives. The aircraft responded, climbing slightly, finding balance in the chaos. Ward exhaled for the first time in minutes, his chest loosening. "I can't believe this," he muttered, glancing at Rex with a mix of awe and gratitude. Daniel's voice softened, though it remained firm. "You don't need to believe. You just need to follow." The cockpit settled into a strange rhythm, Rex sensing, Daniel commanding, Ward executing. The three of them became a living system, a fragile chain holding back the fury of the storm. Outside, lightning still split the heavens, thunder still roared, but inside, the chaos bent slowly toward order. Rex's amber eyes never left the storm. His muzzle twitched, ears adjusting, body tilting. Each subtle shift spoke volumes to Daniel, who had spent years training with him, learning the language of instinct and balance that no instrument could replicate. The dog was old now, his muzzle touched with white, but his spirit burned steady. This was his battlefield too, and he would not falter. Ward glanced sideways at Daniel. How does he know?" Daniel's gaze remained fixed forward, his storm-colored eyes unwavering. "The body doesn't lie. Dogs feel gravity in ways we ignore. He reads the world through muscle and bone. That's why I trust him more than I'd ever trust a screen." Ward's green eyes lingered on Daniel, then on Rex, before nodding slowly. For the first time, his hands on the yoke no longer shook. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, her chest tightening as tears blurred her vision. She wasn't crying from fear now, but from something deeper, something like faith reborn. Mark exhaled, a low sound that almost resembled a laugh. "God help me, but I think we might actually make it." Another jolt came, less violent than before. Rex turned his head slightly upward, nose twitching. Daniel's voice came immediately, calm but commanding. "Nose up 2 degrees, steady climb." "Hold it." Ward adjusted, and the aircraft lifted smoothly through the turbulence. The roar of the engine steadied further, no longer desperate but strong, resilient. The storm still raged, but for the first time in what felt like eternity, hope filled the cockpit. The cabin had fallen into a tense silence, broken only by the groans of the fuselage and the occasional metallic rattle of overhead bins. It was the silence of people who had run out of words, who were now holding on to something beyond speech. Every tilt of the wings, every shudder in the floor seemed amplified in the hush, each one echoing through bodies pressed tightly into their seats. Outside, the storm still snarled against the windows, lightning sketching jagged scars across the black sky, but inside the passengers sat in collective suspension, waiting for fate to reveal its verdict. Marjorie Lane, the elderly widow with pearl earrings and silver hair, folded her hands around her prayer book and closed her eyes. Her lips moved in rhythm, whispering the same verse she had repeated since the turbulence began. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Yet her ears caught every subtle change in the plane's movement, and for the first time she noticed something. It wasn't chaos anymore. The plane's sways had a rhythm, like the rocking of a cradle instead of the thrashing of a storm. She dared to open her eyes, and in the dim light she found courage in the steadiness she now felt beneath her. 2 rows ahead, a little girl no more than 8 clung to a stuffed rabbit with frayed ears. She had pale blonde hair that curled into wisps around her small, round face, and her blue eyes shimmered with tears. Her name was Emily Carter, traveling with her mother for the first time overseas. She tugged at her mother's sleeve, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom, is the dog flying the plane?" Her mother, Sarah Carter, turned toward her with trembling lips that curved into a watery smile. Sarah was in her early 30s, slender and graceful, with auburn hair pulled back loosely and freckles scattered across her pale cheeks. She worked as a nurse back in Maine, her days spent comforting strangers, but fear had drained the color from her face tonight. Yet as she looked into her daughter's tearful eyes, she found strength she didn't know she had. Stroking Emily's hair, she whispered, "Yes, sweetheart. That dog is our angel. He's saving us." Tears rolled down her cheeks, but they were not only tears of fear. They carried relief, gratitude, and awe. The words carried across the silence, and other passengers heard. A murmur rose among them, not of panic, but of wonder. Eyes turned toward the cockpit door, as though they could see through the steel barrier to the loyal German shepherd guiding their survival. Ethan Brooks, the anxious young man in the hoodie, pressed his forehead to the seat in front of him. He had always considered himself too skeptical, too hardened by the disappointments of neglectful parents, and a life that forced him to fend for himself too early. But now, hearing the child's voice and the mother's whispered answer, something softened inside him. He muttered aloud, not to anyone in particular. Maybe miracles do exist. His voice shook, but not from panic, this time from the weight of humility. In the aisle, Clara Mendoza paused in her steady rounds of reassurance. The tall flight attendant, her dark eyes weary but resilient, had been keeping order as best she could. Now, hearing the exchange between Emily and Sarah, she allowed herself a moment of pause. A faint smile touched her lips, the first she had felt in what seemed like hours. Her heart thudded not just with fear, but with pride. Pride in her crew, in the passengers who were holding together, and most of all in the ragged man and his loyal dog in the cockpit. Across the cabin, Richard Cole, the arrogant businessman with slicked blonde hair and an expensive suit, shifted uncomfortably. He had mocked earlier, sneering at the idea of trusting a vagabond and his mutt. Now, however, he felt the subtle steadiness in the plane's motion, the strange calm that had replaced chaos. His jaw clenched, and for once he said nothing. His wife, Eleanor Cole, a dignified woman in her mid-50s with soft gray eyes and neatly styled brunette hair, reached out and squeezed his hand. Unlike Richard, she was gentle by nature, shaped by years of volunteering at community shelters. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You don't have to admit it out loud, Richard. But you know he's saving us." Richard avoided her gaze, but his silence was admission enough. The passengers collectively began to adjust. Whispered prayers softened into murmurs of hope. Fear-stricken faces took on new expressions, some cautious, some reverent. The rhythm of the plane's movement was no longer terrifying but strangely soothing, each adjustment like a note in a song, a melody played by an invisible orchestra led by a man, a boy pilot, and a dog. In the cockpit, Daniel's commands continued in steady cadence. His gravelly voice, low and deliberate, gave each instruction with surgical precision. "Trim 2 degrees up. Hold, now ease right. Good. Don't overcorrect. Let it breathe. Ward followed, his green eyes darting nervously at first, then more assuredly as his hands found rhythm with Daniel's voice and Rex's unerring signals. Each shift of the dog's muzzle, each brace of his shoulders, became cues in a language of survival that Ward was only beginning to understand. The storm raged outside, yet inside the aircraft a strange harmony unfolded. It was as if the chaos of nature had been translated into music, one that only Rex could read and Daniel could conduct, while Ward played it through his trembling but determined hands. Back in the cabin, Emily snuggled against her mother, whispering, "When we land, can I hug the dog?" Sarah let out a shaky laugh, her auburn hair falling across her forehead. "Yes, Emily. I think everyone will want to hug him," Marjorie heard, and added softly, though her voice trembled with age, "He is God's messenger tonight." Her prayer book remained clutched to her chest, but for the first time she looked not down at the words, but up, as though expecting to see a divine sign etched in the storm clouds. Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring at the overhead light that flickered less now. For the first time in his young life, he felt the power of faith not as something distant, but as something real, unfolding before him through the instincts of an old German shepherd. He whispered to himself, "If a dog can do this, maybe I can do more with my life than just survive." Even Richard, who had scoffed at the idea of divine intervention, pressed his lips together, his arrogance cracking like plaster. Eleanor held his hand tighter, sensing the quiet shift within him. The passengers sat together in that moment, each one a note in the larger symphony of survival. The plane trembled less violently, its path smoothing into something almost graceful. And though the storm continued to claw at the fuselage, inside the hearts of those aboard, another force had begun to rise. Trust. For the first time, they were not just passengers on a doomed flight. They were witnesses to a miracle in motion, a living testament that faith could be found in the unlikeliest of messengers. A man with a scarred past, and a dog with an unshakable nose for truth. The minutes stretched into eternity, every second stitched together by the steady rhythm of Rex's instincts, Daniel's calm commands, and Ward's hesitant but determined hands. The storm had been their world, endless, merciless, swallowing them whole. But storms, however mighty, were not eternal. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the turbulence shifted. The violent jolts gave way to a smoother, rolling sway, like the ocean calming after a tantrum. Ward blinked, his green eyes wide, his chest still heaving from the adrenaline. He glanced at the instruments, at first thinking his exhausted mind was deceiving him. The static clutter that had filled the radar began to thin, and in the distance of the screen, clearer patches emerged. The needles, once spinning wildly, steadied into something resembling order. Rex lifted his head, ears pricking sharply, then relaxed his posture. His muzzle tilted upward, his amber eyes locking on the streak of darkness beyond the cockpit glass that was now breaking into softer gray. The dog gave a low, steady whine, not of fear, but of recognition. Daniel Harper followed his companion's gaze. His storm-gray eyes softened, the hard lines of tension around them loosening. A lifetime of skies, of missions that ended in both triumph and tragedy, gave him the ability to recognize what Ward could not yet trust. "We're breaking through," Daniel said quietly, almost reverently. His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen enough storms to know when one was finally loosening its grip. Ward's hands trembled, not with fear now, but with something else, something almost holy. Tears welled in his green eyes, spilling before he could stop them. He laughed shakily, voice breaking. We're through. Oh God, we're actually through. Clara Mendoza pressed both hands to her chest, her tall frame sagging against the doorway as relief washed over her. Mark Thompson, the broad-shouldered attendant beside her, let out a long exhale, his lips breaking into a grin that was half disbelief, half joy. Behind them, Captain Sloane stirred again in his seat, his square jaw tightening as his eyelids fluttered open. His skin was still pale, damp with sweat, but his voice rasped, low and ragged. Status? Ward laughed again, a sound cracking under the release of pressure. The storm's clearing. We've got stability. His voice broke on the last word. Daniel reached down and rested a hand on Rex's sturdy back, feeling the rise and fall of the dog's chest. He rubbed the thick fur, his gravelly voice soft. Good work, partner. Couldn't have done it without you. Rex leaned into the touch, amber eyes half closing, a soldier content with duty fulfilled. The cockpit lights blinked, first a flicker, then steady. The radio hissed, static breaking, until a clear voice pierced through like sunlight through clouds. Ocean Air 417, do you read? We have your signal. Please report, status. Ward froze, stunned, then scrambled to answer. His voice cracked as he grabbed the mic. This is Ocean Air 417. We read you. Aircraft stabilized, braking storm line. Captain incapacitated but responsive. We have assistance. His last word came out shaky, but filled with awe. The controller's voice came back, clipped and professional, but to those inside the aircraft, it sounded like a choir of angels. Copy 417. Maintain heading. You are in contact. We have you on scope. In the cabin, the faint sound of the radio transmission carried, echoing through the intercom. Passengers looked at each other with disbelief, then erupted in murmurs, sobs, and even laughter. Marjorie Lane pressed her prayer book to her lips and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Ethan Brooks covered his face with his hands, shaking with a mix of relief and tears. Little Emily Carter clutched her stuffed rabbit and gasped, "We're saved!" Her mother Sarah wrapped her arms around her tightly, auburn hair tumbling loose as she wept openly, whispering over and over, "Yes, baby. We're safe now." Even Richard Cole, the arrogant businessman, sat silently, his expensive suit rumpled and his slicked hair damp with sweat. His wife Eleanor squeezed his hand tightly, her gentle gray eyes shining with gratitude. For once, Richard had no words. Back in the cockpit, Ward wiped his eyes quickly, trying to regain composure, though his shoulders still trembled. "I thought we were done," he admitted, voice raw. Daniel gave him a steady look. "You were never alone." Remember that his voice carried not just for Ward, but for every soul on the plane. Captain Sloane shifted, his strong features tightening as consciousness returned in fragments. He looked at Daniel, at Rex, then at Ward with dawning comprehension. Though his body was still weak, his pride remained. Who kept us steady?" he rasped. Ward glanced at Daniel, then at Rex, a smile tugging at his lips despite the tears. "All of us," he said, "but mostly him." His gaze dropped to the German shepherd, still seated proudly on the floor, ears perked, amber eyes unyielding. Daniel ruffled Rex's fur again, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his bearded face. "You hear that? You're the hero tonight." Outside the cockpit, the storm clouds began to thin, patches of moonlight filtering through like blessings from heaven. The horizon, once a wall of black fury, now revealed threads of silver light that promised land, safety, and morning. The plane, battered but unbroken, carried onward. Inside, passengers and crew held on to the fragile miracle that had kept them alive, the miracle of trust. Trust in a man scarred by the past, a young pilot learning to believe, and a dog whose instincts had bridged the silence when machines had failed. The runway lights stretched out like a river of fireflies against the damp blackness of the Boston night. Rain streaked across the windows as the wheels met the tarmac with a shuddering thump. For a breathless moment, the aircraft bounced, tires protesting against wet pavement, and then steadied, roaring forward as reverse thrust boomed and spoilers deployed. The storm was behind them now, left in the dark horizon, and ahead lay safety, ground, and the promise of survival. Inside the cabin, silence hung for half a heartbeat. Then, as the realization struck, the passengers erupted. Applause thundered through the narrow space, echoing against the walls, building into a chorus that drowned even the engines. People sobbed openly, clapped until their palms stung, and some shouted words of praise. But the applause was not only for the pilots or the crew. It was for the unlikely savior who still sat calmly in the cockpit, his amber eyes watchful, his chest rising and falling with steady dignity. Rex, the aging German shepherd with a grizzled muzzle, shifted his ears at the noise but did not flinch. His body was tired, his paws spread wide for balance. But there was pride in his stance, the quiet pride of a soldier who had done his duty. James Ward, the young co-pilot, let out a shaky laugh as he eased the plane down the taxiway. His green eyes were red from tears, his youthful face pale but glowing with relief. He glanced down at Rex and shook his head in disbelief. "We couldn't have done it without you, boy." Daniel Harper rested a weathered hand on Rex's back, his storm-gray eyes softening. His beard shadowed his tired smile, and his gravelly voice came low. "He already knows." Captain William Sloane, still pale from his earlier collapse, leaned weakly in his chair. His square jaw clenched, but his eyes, blue and sharp even in exhaustion, rested on Rex with respect. A man who had once demanded perfection from every crew member now found himself humbled by an animal. "A true professional," he murmured, half to himself. Clara Mendoza, standing behind him, gave a shaky laugh, brushing tears from her dark eyes. The plane rolled to its gate, the engines powering down until the roar faded into a hush, broken only by sobs and murmurs. The cabin lights glowed warm again, golden against the damp faces of survivors. When the seatbelt sign dimmed, passengers stood almost at once, but not with the impatient rush of routine flights. This time they stood as though rising in a chapel, unified by reverence. Marjorie Lane, the silver-haired widow, clutched her prayer book to her chest, tears streaking down her wrinkled cheeks. "Thank you, Lord, for sending us your messenger." She whispered the words, but knew others heard. Ethan Brooks, the anxious young man who had doubted miracles all his life, wiped his eyes roughly with the sleeve of his hoodie. Maybe faith isn't just a story after all." Little Emily Carter squeezed her stuffed rabbit tightly as she bounced in her seat. Her blonde curls stuck to her damp cheeks, and her wide blue eyes searched for the dog. "Can I see him, Mommy?" "I want to thank him." Sarah Carter, her auburn-haired mother, hugged her daughter close and whispered, "Yes, Emily." We all will. Richard Cole, the wealthy businessman, stood awkwardly, his expensive suit creased and damp. His arrogance had cracked completely now, replaced by something rawer. Shame. Eleanor, his wife, slipped her hand into his and whispered, "He saved us, Richard." That man and his dog Richard swallowed hard and gave a single nod, unable to find words. When the cockpit door opened, Daniel stepped out first, his coat stained, boots scuffed, beard rough. He looked nothing like the hero the newspapers would later write about. But at his side, Rex padded forward, his tail steady, his gait strong despite his years. And it was Rex, not Daniel, who drew the breath of the cabin into silence. One by one, passengers clapped again, softer this time, like a standing ovation in a theater. Emily gasped aloud. There he is, the angel dog, her small voice cracked with joy. Sarah cried openly as she kissed her daughter's head. Ethan whispered, That's him. That's the one who saved us. Even Richard, eyes wet despite himself, raised his hands in applause. Flashbulbs exploded as soon as the door to the jetway opened. News had already spread. Radios, social media, whispers carried faster than storms. On the wet pavement, reporters had gathered, their cameras raised, their microphones thrust forward. Headline words were already being spoken. Hero dog lands plane. German Shepherd saves 200 lives. Miracle in the storm. At the center of the chaos, Daniel stood quietly, his hand resting protectively on Rex's head. When asked for comment, his storm-gray eyes held the crowd with steady calm. His voice was low, gravelly, carrying no trace of pride. I only trusted my dog. He's the hero, not me. Rex pressed against his leg, amber eyes glowing in the light of flashing bulbs. He did not understand the frenzy of human attention, but he understood his master's touch, and that was enough. On the wet tarmac, the golden floodlights bathed them both, man and dog, in a halo against the storm-washed night. Passengers watched from the windows, tears in their eyes, as the two walked side by side across the rain-slick ground. In that moment, it was not just survival that had been won, but something greater, a reminder that faith and loyalty could shine brighter than any storm. Daniel Harper and Rex became more than survivors that night. They became symbols, not of glory, not of medals, but of something quieter, deeper. The bond between man and dog, the miracle of instinct and trust, the truth that sometimes salvation comes not from machines or men in uniforms, but from the steady heart of a four-legged companion. And so they walked together into the lights of Boston's stormy night, leaving behind not just footprints in the rain, but a story that would live on. A story of a loyal dog, a weary man, and the miracle of faith that carried them all safely home. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning. They come quietly, on four paws, in the loyalty of a creature who refuses to give up when all seems lost. That night, it wasn't just a man and a machine that carried everyone home. It was faith, courage, and a loyal heart created by God Himself. In our daily lives, storms will come too. Not always in the sky, but in our families, our work, or our hearts. And in those storms, God often sends us unexpected messengers, sometimes a friend, sometimes a stranger, sometimes even a faithful dog, to remind us that we are never truly alone. If this story touched you, share it so others may find hope in it. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss more stories of faith and loyalty. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide you safely through every storm in your life.